I'm not usually one to buy things off Craigslist, but when my laptop suddenly died, I figured I'd try to save some money and find a used one online. After a lot of scrolling, I found what seemed like a great deal, an almost new MacBook Pro for half the retail price. The seller, who went by the name Brian, claimed he needed quick cash and was willing to meet in person to make the sale. It seemed straightforward, so I agreed. We decided to meet at a coffee shop not too far from my place. It was one of those cozy spots with warm lighting, exposed brick walls, and soft jazz playing in the background. I arrived about 15 minutes early, grabbed a seat near the window, and ordered a coffee while I waited. The place wasn't too crowded, mostly students, and a few people tapping away on their laptops. As I sat there, I noticed something odd. A black SUV parked across the street, its engine running but with no one visibly inside. I didn't think much of it at first, but every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow shifting inside, as if someone was watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just someone waiting for a friend. Brian walked in a few minutes later. He was a bit older than I expected, maybe in his late 30s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He was dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans, carrying a black backpack that I assumed held the laptop. He scanned the room nervously before spotting me and heading over. "Are you Tom?" he asked, his voice low and a little shaky. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to keep things casual. But I couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in his hands as he set the backpack on the table. He pulled out the laptop and opened it up, showing me that it worked fine. It looked like it was in perfect condition, just as he described in the listing. The screen was flawless, and the specs matched up. But something about Brian's demeanor was unsettling. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to come in at any moment. "Looks good," I said, trying to ease the tension. "So, why are you selling it?" Brian hesitated, his eyes darting to the door before answering. "Just need the cash. Been going through a rough time lately." I nodded, not wanting to pry, and handed him the cash I'd brought with me. He counted it quickly, shoved it into his pocket, and then stood up abruptly. "Thanks, man. I appreciate it," he muttered, his eyes still scanning the room. "Listen, you should probably get out of here soon." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "Why? Is something wrong?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his backpack and hurried out of the coffee shop, leaving me sitting there with the laptop and a growing sense of dread. I watched him disappear down the street, but before he turned the corner, I saw him glance back at the coffee shop one last time, his face pale and full of fear. Feeling uneasy, I decided to leave as well. As I stood up to go, I noticed a crumpled piece of paper sticking out from under the laptop's keyboard. I hadn't seen it earlier. Curious, I unfolded it and found a hastily written note. "Get rid of it. Don't go home. They're watching." My heart skipped a beat as I read the words. I glanced around the coffee shop, but no one seemed to be paying attention to me. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The black SUV was still parked outside, and I could now clearly see the outline of a figure sitting in the driver's seat, their face obscured by the shadows. I quickly shoved the note into my pocket and walked out of the shop, trying to act normal. The moment I stepped outside, I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate, like someone was trying to match my pace. I turned around, but no one was there. Just the usual pedestrians going about their day. But the footsteps continued, always a few steps behind me, even though no one was close enough to be making them. I picked up my pace, my heart racing, and headed to my car parked a block away. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally as I walked, as if they were reaching out for me. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent. But when I looked back, there was still no one there. By the time I reached my car, I was practically running. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped off without looking back. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, like a shadow darting across the back seat. But when I turned to look, the seat was empty. When I finally got home, I rushed inside and bolted the door, my mind racing. I decided to plug in the laptop and see if there was anything on it that could explain what was happening. But as soon as I turned it on, the screen flickered, and then the webcam light blinked on for a brief moment before going dark. I hadn't even opened a program yet. That was the final straw. My mind was screaming at me that something was terribly wrong. I grabbed my phone and called the police, hoping they could help make sense of this bizarre situation. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice did little to ease my nerves. I bought a laptop off Craigslist, I stammered, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. And now I think someone's following me. There's something wrong with the laptop. I found a note that said they're watching me. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, can you give me your address? I rattled it off, my voice shaky. The dispatcher assured me that officers would be on their way, but even as I hung up, I felt like it was already too late. I paced around my apartment, waiting for the police to arrive, but the tension was unbearable. The shadows in my living room seemed to shift and grow, twisting into dark, unnatural shapes. I kept hearing those footsteps again, echoing from the hallway. But no matter how many times I checked, the hall was empty. 15 minutes passed, then 20. I called the police again, demanding to know where they were, but they insisted officers were en route. I was starting to think they weren't coming. I could feel the walls closing in, the shadows tightening their grip around me. Then, just as I was about to call the police for a third time, I heard a knock at the door. I ran to it, relieved that help had finally arrived. But when I looked through the peephole, there was no one there, just the dark, empty hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away from the door. I heard the knock again, louder this time, more insistent. But it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The window blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just outside, silhouetted against the pale light of the street lamp. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. I was paralyzed with fear. The knock came again, a slow, deliberate tap against the glass. I could see the shadow of a hand reaching up to knock again, but I couldn't bring myself to move, to run, to even breathe. Finally, the sound of sirens in the distance snapped me out of my trance. I rushed to the door, flung it open, and ran down the hallway toward the safety of the approaching police. But when I looked back, the figure was gone, vanished into the night. The police arrived moments later, and I frantically told them everything that had happened. They searched my apartment, but there was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence of anyone outside the window. The laptop, which I had left on the kitchen table, was now off, its screen black and unresponsive. The officers looked at me with a mix of concern and skepticism, but they assured me they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. They offered to have someone stay with me for the night, but I declined, feeling like I'd already dragged them into something they couldn't understand. After they left, I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I packed a bag and drove to a nearby hotel, determined to get as far away from the laptop and whatever was attached to it as possible. The next morning, I drove out to a remote area outside the city, where I found an old abandoned junkyard. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I tossed the laptop into a rusty, broken-down dumpster, and as I turned to leave, I heard those footsteps again, echoing across the empty lot. I spun around, but no one was there. Just rows of decaying cars and piles of twisted metal. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe, as if they were alive, reaching out for me. I ran back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest, and sped away, leaving the laptop behind. But as I drove home, I noticed the black SUV in my rearview mirror. It was following me, keeping its distance but never letting me out of its sight. I took random turns trying to lose it, but it stuck with me, its headlights glaring like cold, unblinking eyes. Eventually, I managed to lose the SUV in a crowded downtown area, but the feeling of being watched never left me. For days, I kept seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hearing those damn footsteps behind me wherever I went. Even at home, I couldn't escape it. I'd hear whispers through the walls, the creak of floorboards when no one else was there. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up and moved out of town, changed my number, deleted my Craigslist account, and cut ties with everyone who might know where I'd gone. But even now in a new city, far from where it all started, I still feel it. The shadows, the footsteps, the cold eyes watching me from the dark. I had been hunting for a gaming PC for months. My current setup was ancient, barely able to run the most basic games without lagging or crashing. With a tight budget, I couldn't afford a new one, so I turned to Craigslist, hoping to find a decent deal. After countless hours of searching, I finally stumbled upon a listing that seemed too good to be true. The ad was simple: high-end gaming PC, 500 OBO, must sell fast. The specs were listed in detail, and they were impressive. Top-of-the-line graphics card, plenty of RAM, a high-speed processor, and even a custom water cooling system. The accompanying photo showed a sleek black tower with RGB lighting, glowing faintly in the dimly lit room where it was photographed. The price was ridiculously low, far below what it should have been. But the seller, Chris, claimed he was moving overseas and needed to sell everything quickly. My excitement overpowered my skepticism. I messaged Chris immediately, and he responded within minutes. His eagerness to close the deal was palpable, almost desperate. He suggested we meet halfway, since we lived in different towns. He offered to meet on the road near a rest stop, where we could easily pull over and complete the transaction. It was a bit odd, but I rationalized it. Maybe he was in a hurry, or maybe he just didn't want a stranger knowing where he lived. I agreed to meet him the following evening after work. The drive out to the meeting spot was uneventful, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of unease crept in. The highway was desolate, with only the occasional car passing by. The rest stop where we planned to meet was nothing more than a small, poorly lit area with a couple of vending machines and a grimy bathroom. As I approached the location, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Chris had told me he'd be waiting in a black sedan, and sure enough, as I neared the rest stop, I spotted the car pulled over on the shoulder. Its headlights were off, and there was no movement inside. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, but the lure of the deal was too strong. I pulled up a few feet behind the sedan and killed my engine. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. As I stepped out of my car, the cold evening breeze sent a chill down my spine. "Chris?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet night. The driver's side door of the sedan creaked open, and a tall figure stepped out. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled up, casting a shadow over his face. The only thing I could make out was his mouth, a thin line that didn't move when he spoke. "Yeah, I'm Chris," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The PC's in the trunk. You got the cash?" Something about his tone set me on edge, but I nodded and pulled out the envelope of cash I had prepared. He turned and walked to the back of his car, popping open the trunk. I followed him, trying to keep my nerves in check. The trunk opened with a low creak, revealing the gaming PC. It was even more impressive in person, a beast of a machine that looked like it could handle anything I threw at it. But something was off. The fans were humming softly, the power button was illuminated, and the RGB lights were flickering in and out. How was it running without being plugged in? "Wait," I said, my brow furrowing. "How is it on?" Before I could process the situation, Chris moved faster than I could react. He spun around and I felt a sharp, burning pain in my side. I gasped, stumbling back as he pulled a knife out of me, the blade slick with my blood. I fell to the ground, clutching my side as the world spun around me. My vision blurred, but I could see Chris standing over me, his face still hidden in the shadow of his hood. There was no fear, no remorse, just a cold, calculated intent in his posture. "You should have known better," he muttered, almost to himself, as he pocketed the envelope of cash that had slipped from my grasp. "This is how it always ends." He reached into the trunk and, with surprising ease, lifted the PC out. The lights on the tower flickered one last time before going dark, as if the machine knew what was happening. I lay there helpless, watching him walk back to his car with the PC in one hand, the knife in the other. My breaths came in ragged gasps, the pain in my side growing with each passing second. I tried to call out, to shout for help, but the words caught in my throat. Chris placed the PC in the back seat and closed the trunk. He paused for a moment, looking down at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he got into his car, started the engine, and drove off, leaving me bleeding out on the side of the road. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly as I lay there, the cold asphalt beneath me, soaking up the warmth from my body. I tried to stay conscious, to focus on something other than the pain, but it was getting harder to keep my eyes open. Just when I thought it was over, I heard the distant rumble of a truck approaching. The sound grew louder, and I forced myself to turn my head toward the road. A large semi was pulling off the highway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver must have seen me because the truck came to a stop, and I heard the door open. "Hey, are you okay?" a voice shouted, footsteps running toward me. I tried to respond, but all that came out was a weak groan. The trucker knelt beside me, his face a blur as my vision faded in and out. "Hang on, I'm calling for help," he said, his voice calm but urgent. I heard him talking into his phone, his words a jumbled mess in my mind. The world around me started to fade, the darkness closing in. The last thing I remembered was the feeling of relief that someone had found me, that maybe I would survive this after all. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils. The pain in my side was dulled, replaced by a heavy numbness. A nurse was by my side, her expression soft with concern. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "The trucker who found you probably saved your life." The police visited me later that day, taking my statement. They asked about Chris, about the PC, but there wasn't much I could tell them. The car he was driving had fake plates, and there were no leads on who he really was. They suspected he had done this before, luring victims with too-good-to-be-true deals and then robbing or worse. Weeks passed, and the investigation went cold. Chris had vanished without a trace, taking the money and the gaming PC with him. I was left with nothing but the scars, both physical and emotional, to remind me of that night. I never found out who he was or what his real motive had been. All I knew was that I had narrowly escaped with my life, and I would never trust a Craigslist deal again. Now, whenever I see a too-good-to-be-true listing online, I can't help but feel a pang of dread, because I know that somewhere out there, Chris is waiting for his next victim. And next time, they might not be as lucky as I was. I was looking for a weekend getaway, somewhere quiet where I could clear my mind. Scrolling through Craigslist, I found an ad for a cabin rental deep in the woods. The pictures showed a cozy, rustic cabin surrounded by trees with a small lake nearby. The ad mentioned it was perfect for those who wanted to escape the city and experience nature. The price was a steal, just $50 a night. The catch? The owner wanted to meet in person, to hand over the keys and show me the place. It sounded a bit old-fashioned, but I didn't mind. I liked the idea of a hands-on owner who cared about their property. I messaged the owner, a man named Dale, and we arranged to meet at a small diner about an hour's drive from the cabin. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. A lone building on a deserted road, surrounded by nothing but trees. I arrived a little early and ordered a coffee while I waited. Dale showed up right on time. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with a rugged look, gray stubble, a weathered face, and dressed in worn flannel. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nice to meet you," he said, his voice gravelly. "The cabin's a bit of a drive from here, but it's worth it. You won't find a more peaceful place." We sat down, and he pulled out a small, worn map from his pocket, showing me the route to the cabin. As he traced the path with his finger, I couldn't help but notice the deep lines on his hands, like he'd spent years working outdoors. He handed me the keys and gave me a few instructions. No fires outside the designated pit, keep the windows closed at night, and lock the door before dark. "Why lock the door?" I asked, half joking. "There's no one out there, right?" Dale's smile faltered for a moment before he answered. "Just a precaution. You never know what might wander by in the woods." His tone was light, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. Still, I thanked him and paid for the rental. As I got up to leave, Dale's hand rested on my shoulder for a moment. "Enjoy your stay," he said quietly. "And remember, lock the door." The drive to the cabin took me deep into the forest, the paved road giving way to a dirt path that seemed to go on forever. Just as I started to worry that I'd taken a wrong turn, the trees parted, revealing the cabin. It was exactly like the pictures, small, wooden, and charmingly rustic. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun, and everything was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I unpacked and settled in, enjoying the peace and quiet. As the sun began to set, I built a fire in the fireplace and made myself dinner. The cabin had no TV or internet, so I spent the evening reading by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. It was exactly the escape I needed. But as the night wore on, the quiet started to feel oppressive. The darkness outside was absolute, with no streetlights or distant city glow to break it. I felt isolated, cut off from the world. The only light came from the fire, casting flickering shadows across the room. I couldn't shake Dale's words from earlier. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting something or someone to appear. Eventually, I got up and locked it, just to ease my mind. I was about to head to bed when I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, like something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, but then I heard it again, closer this time, like footsteps crunching on the gravel path leading to the cabin. My heart started to race. I stood frozen, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then, a loud knock echoed through the cabin, the sound reverberating in the stillness. I didn't move, too scared to even breathe. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Hey, it's Dale. I need to talk to you." Relief flooded through me. Maybe he had forgotten something important or wanted to check on me. I walked to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. Something was off. Why had he driven all the way out here in the middle of the night? And why hadn't I heard a car? I backed away from the door, my unease growing. "What do you need, Dale?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, then the voice answered. "Just open the door, it's important." But something in his tone was different, darker, almost sinister. My hand instinctively reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely alone. "I think I'll stay inside," I said, my voice shaking now. There was silence, then the voice outside spoke again, lower this time. "Let me in." Panic surged through me. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and backed away from the door, trying to stay calm. The knocking started again, more frantic, the door rattling, as if something was trying to force its way in. I retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The knocking continued, louder and louder, mixed with the sound of scraping, like nails on wood. I pressed my ear to the window and listened, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. I didn't dare move, staying huddled in the corner of the room until the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. When I finally gathered the courage to leave the room, I found the front door wide open. The wood around the lock was splintered, as if someone, or something, had forced it open. There were deep scratches on the door and on the floor leading to it. I didn't stick around to find out what had happened. I grabbed my things, jumped in my car, and drove away as fast as I could. When I got back to the diner, I asked the waitress about Dale, but she just gave me a blank look. "No one by that name around here," she said, "and that cabin's been abandoned for years." I left the keys on the counter and drove straight home, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I'll never forget that voice and the feeling that something was waiting for me in those woods.